Not long ago, I was a teacher. One day I was sitting at my desk, looking at my email inbox, the pile of grading I had to do, the packages I had to mail, and the stuff that I had to pick up off the floor, and I just broke down. I couldn't do it. I had a panic attack. I thought I was lazy or just incompetent at being an adult. Turns out I was wrong. There's a reason I struggle so much doing everyday things, and it's called pathological demand avoidance. It's real, and it's not my fault. If this sounds familiar, it's not your fault either. So let's talk about it. Hey, welcome to Neurosaucy. Today we are talking about pathological demand avoidance. Pathological demand avoidance is a cluster of traits that can sometimes show up in autistic people. It's not in the DSM, but it's been gaining recognition as a profile of autism. Other neurodivergent conditions can have some of these traits, but PDA organizations specifically recognize this as part of autism. According to PDA North America and the PDA Society of the UK, both of which are linked in the description, the profile of a person with PDA has these general characteristics. They avoid everyday tasks, sometimes including things they enjoy. They are social and can use their social ability to avoid demands. They can display obsessive behavior, and they have an anxiety-based need for control. We'll talk about all of these in just a minute. First, though, I want to address the pathological label. Most discussions about characteristics of neurodivergent conditions like autism, ADHD, OCD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and so on are medicalized. Pathological in a medical context means something that's not normal, something that is extreme or evidence of a disease. Neurodivergent folks aren't a fan of that term. Our brains and our ways of thinking aren't evidence of disease. We're not sick. We're different. Some people, instead of persistent pathological demand for avoidance, call it persistent drive for autonomy instead, which I like a lot. As you'll see, the need for autonomy is a really prevalent aspect about PDA. I want to make it clear that I'm trying not to medicalize these characteristics. I want to describe and humanize them. So from here on, I'll either be saying demand avoidance or PDA instead. So let's talk about what exactly demand avoidance is. The demand part of demand avoidance includes things like appointments, schoolwork, work, and errands, and self-care activities like washing, dressing, and eating. Not just the things we have to do and don't want to do, though. Sometimes we avoid things that we want to do or enjoy doing. This avoidance can be really variable. I can avoid a chore or an errand or a project for weeks on end until one day my brain just goes, hey, you know that thing I haven't been able to do for a really long time now? Just kidding, let's do it. Someone with PDA can be completely capable of doing something one day with no problem and be unable to do it the next. Unfortunately, other people can look at this and think it means we're faking or being lazy. It's not laziness. I hear you saying, why don't you just insert self-help advice here? We'll get there, don't worry. I'll mostly be covering the social aspects of PDA, but there are a lot of dimensions to it, which I'll cover in future videos. In addition to extreme demand avoidance, there are some unique characteristics of PDA autism. All autistic people struggle with social interaction in one way or another, but people with PDA can be more outwardly social. People with PDA can come off as pretty friendly or even chatty. This might be genuinely true. Not all autistic people are super awkward and antisocial. Autism being what it is, though, we still do lack some social understanding or context, and it can be hard to process social communication. Here's what the PDA Society of the UK has to say about these social aspects of demand avoidance. People with PDA are likely to have good verbal fluency, disguising difficulties in understanding and processing verbal communication. Expressive language may be fluent and articulate with more difficulties in receptive language. Good fluency of speech can often mask difficulties with processing. Likely to struggle to appreciate or acknowledge social hierarchy. May be chatty, charming, or extroverted, especially when feeling calm or safe, or may be more introverted and keen not to draw attention to themselves. May copy or mimic social interactions as a way of coping and fitting in. Can be controlling and dominating, particularly when they feel they are not in control. We'll address the issue of control later on in this video. Often seen overestimation of comprehension based on mistaken evaluation of expression, regardless of underlying cognitive functioning. Many children are over-reliant on the expressive use of questions, sometimes not waiting for, not understanding, or not processing the responses given. This clearly impacts their ability to deal with associated explicit and implicit demands. Let me simplify this last one to the best of my ability. Basically, autistic people, especially kids, can ask a lot of questions, which can give others the impression that they understand something really well, but it can also give the autistic person that impression too. Let's give the example of teenage me. My first job was at McDonald's. When I was training, I asked questions, as you're expected to do. I sort of maybe thought I understood the answers, and so did my trainer. I did not. When I actually tried to do what was asked of me, I couldn't. I hadn't fully processed the instructions, so I actually didn't know what the hell I was doing. That leads me to the next part of the social aspects of demand avoidance, using social skills as avoidance. Someone with PDA might just straight up refuse to do something, or give excuses, or negotiate, create distractions, or procrastinate. They aren't trying to be manipulative for malicious reasons. They're just using their social skills to try and remove themselves from the situation and the pressure of obligation. If it gets bad enough, the situation can end up in a shutdown or a meltdown. Going back to 14-year-old me, I realized I couldn't meet some of the demands that were put upon me at my job, so I avoided doing those things as much as possible, or I just kind of faked it. Eventually, it became clear that I couldn't do some of my job, and I had to confront the fact that I was just trying to skate by, and that made me feel absolutely terrible about myself. What I didn't know about myself at the time was that I needed different types of instructions and more time to process what I was being taught. But because I was seen as a smart kid, everyone just assumed I got it and didn't follow up until I started making mistakes. Let's talk about masking. I'll do a whole other video on masking because it's so prevalent in neurodivergent folks, but it's relevant here because people who experience PDA tend to mask pretty well because they have more social awareness. Masking basically means that we act like the people around us so others can't see that we're different or that we're confused. The PDA Society says social communication assessments reveal a good knowledge of what effective interaction looks like. Individuals are easily able to discuss what they would/should do, but have a slight social processing delay, which means in a fast-paced, real-world situation, they may struggle to do or to say these things. Essentially, we're fake-it-till-you-make-it people. We almost get there, but it tends to fall through in certain situations, especially stressful ones. Our ability to mask may be situation-dependent too, which can confuse people, even experts, who sometimes see us behaving very differently depending on the context, which, according to the PDA Society, can lead to mistaken assumptions that there is an element of choice in that avoidance. People who mask well also have a harder time getting diagnosed because clinicians tend to see them appearing relatively normal when they're really struggling. I think it's really important to emphasize that masking has been ingrained in us by society and the world around us in order to fit in. So it's not something that we can just put down when it comes to being diagnosed. Sometimes it just becomes part of us. It's not something that we can control. Another characteristic of PDA is, according to the PDA Society, obsessive behavior that is often social in nature, for example, can become obsessive about people, either real or fictional, with a love or hate perspective. When I was a teenager especially, I tended to get really, really attached to my friends and to fictional characters. I lived and breathed Buffy the Vampire Slayer for a long time. This obsessive behavior, especially in kids, can show up as extreme clinginess and sometimes a desire to control that person. Another feature of this obsessive behavior, according to the PDA Society, is, quote, whilst other people's strict routines and visual timetables may not be effective and may make the individual more avoidant, it may be that that person has their own quite fixed ideas about how things should be. They often choose to do things in their own time, but in a specific way. Another part of PDA, which in my view is related to the obsessive behavior, is an extreme interest in fantasy and roleplay. A child with PDA can roleplay as a different person or even an animal for a really long time. If you're someone else, it makes you feel like you can avoid whatever you're having trouble doing. Most of my roleplaying has been done in text form. I thankfully found an outlet in writing pretty early, so I just sort of took the role-playing aspect of it and put it into fiction. Ironically, as I got older and had less space in my life for writing, I had to make space for it. It's become kind of a self-imposed demand, which, let me tell you, sucks. It's an example of how PDA can make you unable to do something that you love and want to do. So where does this avoidance come from? The PDA Society and PDA North America say it stems from anxiety. Quote, social and emotional assessments are likely to identify high levels of anxiety, particularly when individuals feel they are not in control or perceive a situation as being too demanding or unpredictable. Research showed that intolerance of uncertainty may be a significant underpinning factor in demand avoidant behaviors in children and young people. It's theorized that demands can be perceived as threats for autonomy with someone with PDA, which is why advocates started to reframe it as persistent drive for autonomy. As an autistic person, you're very often forced to do things you don't have the capacity for or things that are overwhelming. Autonomy is something that many autistic people struggle with, so it's no wonder that any threat is anxiety-provoking. Some situations can feel like an actual physical threat to a person's autonomy. You can imagine this makes school and work really difficult because there's so many things that you have to do. You don't have any choice. So to close this up, this drive for autonomy isn't the autistic person being stubborn, although we're often seen that way. Everyone needs to feel in control of their lives. Just imagine living in fear every minute of every day that you'll have to do something that you can't do. A lot of people have that dream where you're in school, it's like the end of the semester, and you realize that you have a final for a class you've never gone to, and you feel panicked in that dream. It's a little like that, except in real life and all the time. Probably everybody has experienced the moment where you just can't seem to get up and do anything, but PDA takes it to a whole different level. Those of us who experience demand avoidance really, truly cannot make ourselves do something sometimes. It's like your computer when you have so many browser tabs and programs open that you're using 100% of your RAM. Things just slow down, or they don't happen, or your computer just straight up blue screens. We get called lazy, or we think of ourselves as lazy, but that's far from the truth. It takes so much effort to get through the day some days that we just can't do stuff. And that's okay. If you've ever experienced PDA, give yourself some grace. There's a lot more to say about this topic, and I'll be doing future videos on different aspects of PDA, as well as other topics about neurodiversity. Let me know in the comments if anything that I've talked about sounds familiar and how you deal with PDA. See you next time.